maybe that's something you might want to help out with once a month or so. Going to hand over to John.
Morning, everybody. Nice to see you all. If I haven't met you before, yeah, that's who I am, John. We're in the little series where, as Steve said, Jesus is coming into his city, the city of God. He comes as king. He comes to the temple to say, I am changing how human beings and God connect with one another. I'm both fulfilling and transforming our long history. So if you've got little booklets, that's the page we're at today, the end of chapter 20 and beginning of chapter 21. And we've called this Jesus and his footstool. So maybe you get comfy at that. Is that how that works? Yeah, vague chuckle. All right, good. I think I need you to participate a little bit more. I want to show you some pictures of people, and I want you to tell me your thoughts and feelings as you look at this image, maybe what you want to do. Is that okay? Oh, yeah, that said it all, didn't it? What do you feel when you see that picture? And I do want to hear. Pardon? Expensive. Cynical people would call you cynical, Hugh, but I wouldn't. You're a realist. Okay, besides being expensive, children are innocent. Anything else? At peace. Cuddly, yeah. Look at those cheeks. Oh, don't you want to just kiss them? Yeah. Anything else? Full of hope, yeah. Just this new little life. What's it going to become? All right. That's an easy one. What about this one? Fashion statement? This is from a fashion show, yeah? Expensive. Now you're on the right track. Ludicrously expensive, I would say. Cold? I think you'd be in the Arctic and still be overheating with that lot, or I would be. Yeah, what is the point, Lynn? Well, he's trying to make some point, but what point is he making? I don't know. It's very strange. Pardon? Yeah, quite a waste. Exactly. Maybe he's moving house. He's just got everything on because that's cheaper than suitcases. Recycle fashion. Okay, that's good. He's going to hand all that out later. Makes us think different things. All right, what about this picture? Thoughts and feelings. A little bit more puzzling, this one, perhaps. What do you think's going on here? Thinking deeply. They look very studious, don't they? Where might they be? At school, thanks, Annabelle. Someone at school knows what this situation looks like. Maybe we've all forgotten. They're at school, but where are they at school, do you think? Where's your guess? Muslim world? Can we be more specific? Afghanistan, yes.
Couldn't be Afghanistan.
This is an old picture.
Okay.
So this was a picture from a few years in Afghanistan, but this is not happening so much now, is it? Why is that? No school for girls. Wasn't much of a school sitting on the floor and sharing a pencil, but at least it was something. But not now, which is a pretty sad situation. No work for women. Okay. What do you want to do about that? Can we do anything about that? How about this picture? Ouch, painful? Yeah? Crazy? Evil? Can't look at it, I'll get it off quickly. What's the story here? Maybe this guy's gone fishing and is not so good at casting. Do you think that's what's going on? Exhibitionist. Just got carried away with a good thing and didn't know where to stop. You might say, why is this guy doing this to himself? What's driving this that he thinks that's a good look? Maybe you think it's a good look. Is he a nice guy or a bad guy? Go to the next one. All right. This guy walks in. How do you feel? He's an assassin. How do you know such a big word? Scared? Anything else? Any other responses? Friendly fellow to have at church? Threatening? Bravado. He's all swagger, isn't he? A rapper. That doesn't mean on the outside of your lolly. Okay. Does he fit in here if he comes to church? Would we welcome him? No, maybe not with a gun. Yes, that's another country where you can bring guns to church. Hopefully we'll never do that here. What about this fellow? He'd fit in, wouldn't he? This is what you should look like in Gordon. Yeah? Respectable? She's seen this before. Lawyer? Yes, a lawyer. Lawyers all look the same. They smell the same, don't they? Have you ever noticed that lawyers have a certain smell about them? Okay. Yes, Annabelle knew this guy and the previous guy are actually the same guy. And that's a real guy. Jefferson Moon is his name, and he is a lawyer. Graduated from Harvard. We respond to people based on appearances, don't we? Evolution's taught us to do that. It's a sensible thing to do. You size somebody up and should I trust this person or not trust that person? We've got to make a split decision. Is this someone I might like, or is this someone I've got to be wary of? What is this person's character like? We make sorts of assumptions based on how people look. Sometimes those assumptions are accurate, but sometimes they're not. When we prejudge someone based upon their appearance, we call that, put those two words together, to prejudge is prejudice. Often people will prejudge someone based on the colour of their skin. We call that racism. Or based on their gender, sexism. There's lots of those isms. It's not necessarily stupid to size someone up by how they look and how they present and how they behave, but often it is incorrect, isn't it? The flip side, often someone who looks very respectful, like that lawyer guy, is maybe granted too much trust. And that's how abusive people are able to perpetuate their abusiveness, because everyone thinks, oh no, they're a good person, they must be, look. They're in a high-powered job and dress well and present well and speak fluently. So they couldn't do bad things. But we've known in churches and other places that that's not true either, is it? The story we're going to look at today is about those things, how people appear. And how does that fit with reality? Our perception of things, the presumptions that we make, the prejudices that reveal, and does that actually predict who that person is? That's what we're going to look at today, because that's what Luke is telling us about. If you want to turn in your Bible to Luke chapter 20, we're going to read some stuff where Jesus comes into the temple. And he is overturning expectations from what has gone before. I just had an alliteration week, so just forgive me, all right? I just thought I'd play with it. If these words mean nothing to you, just let them go by, okay? I just had a bit of fun, I was bored. So expectations from what's gone before, the antecedents, how people appear, and the actions regarding who they actually are. That's what this passage is all about. And we're going to look at 3 little incidents where Jesus makes claims about himself, but it's overturning appearances. He looks at another group of people who appear one way and he says, no, they're actually another way. And then a third person appears, which raises a question for us. And what appears to be right or wrong is brought up to the surface for us to consider. So there are 3 movements. We're going to have 3 sections today. Is that okay? As we read this passage together, you'll see, hopefully, the 3 sections that I've just referred to. Can we read these words together? If you're not a happy reader, just listen along. Let's read together. When it's speaking of Jesus. So Jesus has been in the temple. Last week, Steve spoke about his argument with the Sadducees about resurrection, and he continues the conversation. But he said to them, how can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David thus calls him Lord, so how is he his son? And in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honour at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box, and he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. 3 movements in that text. Jesus makes a claim that would compel people to follow him if they believe that claim. Jesus rejects the scribes as worthy of being followed because the reality, the actuality belies their appearance. And thirdly, he points to a woman. And the question is, should we follow her example or not? What is Jesus saying there? So that's our 3 sections for today. So firstly, Jesus and this psalm, Psalm 110 is the one that he quotes from. It's a puzzle. It's about a person and a promise and a pathway. If you look in your First Testament, Psalm 110, there's this amazing cryptic little promise that God would send someone to his people, a new leader. And this person would be connected to David, yet greater than David. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. He will have victory. But how, Jesus says, does David call this one his Lord if he is the son of David? It's a fairly evocative picture, the psalm promises. So it's not just being comfy at home with your foot up in front of the telly on the footstool. It's a picture of victory, that the enemies, the conquered leader would be brought in before the king, who would put his feet, literally, on the person's neck or back to symbolise their absolute victory. And the promise of the psalm was that God would send somebody for Israel to deliver them, to bring peace and prosperity by a great victory. And David says, let's explore who this person is. That Jesus says, let's explore who this person is. How can David look forward to this one who's his descendant, his son, and yet he calls him Lord? And these people, these scribes, these experts in biblical interpretation say, I don't know, I'm stumped. They offer no response. These are the people who say, follow me in how I understand Scripture. Jesus is demonstrating here again his ability to understand what God is doing in the world as fulfillment of his communication in Scripture. But he points to a person, and it raises the question, well, who is this person? How is God coming in this person? And what does this person look like? Jesus doesn't answer the question here. If you want the proper answer, you go to Acts chapter 2, Luke's 2nd volume. He writes in 2 volumes, and you see exactly the scene that's played out here. Because Jesus is this figure, isn't he? He's the one he's referring to. He's referring to himself, and he's saying, I am that one that God has sent. And this victory, how I win the victory, is in a surprising fashion. So 2 things I want you to notice. God is present in this way, but in this person, but in a way that they don't anticipate. It's not that just God is using someone, but God comes in someone. This human being, the descendant of David after the flesh, is in fact the Lord himself. This is what Jesus is claiming, and this is what we see outworked. But what God looks like when he comes in the flesh is absolutely back to front. The colours are all wrong. God should come in victory and strength. Jesus comes in weakness. God is the one that we worship and serve, but Jesus is serving others, washing feet. God hangs around with the important people. Jesus is with children, with beggars, with the excluded. It's back to front. And so their prejudice says, no, you can't be the one. That's not what God's servant would look like. Jesus says, think again, for this is who God is, this is who I am. And unless you understand that, you'll never understand what God is doing and promising here. He's exploding the box of prejudice and assumption in front of them. And he's saying, my pathway is actually the pathway of suffering and death. This is why I've come to Jerusalem. I've come to die, to give my life a ransom. This is how God brings his victory, by himself taking on the consequences of all the mess. The disorder in our world, he says, I will deal with it, including our own personal disorder, our sin. But our triumph I'll be raised up through resurrection and then ascension, as Steve spoke about last week. This is the picture of the life of Jesus that we have. That's all to come. It's a strange story. Even when we think we know it, emotionally, often we still can't grapple with this type of God. He's not the God we expect. He's always overturning our assumptions, our prejudices about what God should be like. Paul himself calls it a mystery. Great indeed, we confess, he writes to Timothy, is the mystery of godliness. What's that mystery? He, God, was manifest in the flesh. He was vindicated by the Spirit, that speaks of his resurrection, seen by angels, his ascension, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up in glory. This is the mystery of the life of Jesus, says Paul, and it's really hard to understand even if you believe it already, because it's not what we anticipate of how God should be. This story that Luke is writing for us is complicated. And Jesus is saying, I want you to see something beyond the normal. It has for us both a future hope, but I think it also raises some fears now. The hope is that God will bring things into order, that there will be a day when everything is placed under his feet. Don't we long for that day? That there is not the sort of injustice where girls can't get an education, where people die in poverty. How does that all play out? Well, it doesn't happen now, says Jesus. That is to come. But our fear now, I wonder, is when we think of God interacting with us. Does he want to squish us under his foot? Is this God's way, that he sort of somehow brings a begrudging obedience and allegiance to him by pushing us? Some Christians can work that way of obedience to God, that the motivation becomes fear of God or obligation or guilt or shame. This is not how Jesus deals with people. He works obedience in them by love, to use Paul's expression. This is what faith means. It means trusting in him as good, who has a plan. And even when it's a mess, I can still trust him because he's said what he will do and he's always been faithful in the past. That's our journey with this Jesus, the Son of David, who is David's Lord. That's our first appearance that we need to consider. Any questions or reflections you want to make just to that, you can yell out. Sometimes we have questions at the end, but we'll have them as we go through. Chris? Yeah. Yahweh. Yep. Yeah. I don't know why Bible translators do that. All translation is interpretation. Many of you speak different languages. And you know, when you try and translate something into another language, it's never accurate and like there. You're sort of fudging around for it's sort of like this. And our translations into English of the Bible are exactly the same. Sometimes they're great and sometimes they're not so good. And that's why we have so many different translations. Different people have a crack at it. We'll never get the perfect one, which is why, you know, when we do a sermon, we go back to original languages and do our best and think, I don't know what that means either. But that's what biblical scholars do. And so sometimes you can read something in English and it looks really clear, but you look to the original language and it's different. When we look at complex issues, that's why we always need to go back to the original text as best we have them. And sometimes we don't know exactly what a certain word means. So later in the story, we'll have what's called a hapax legomena, means it only occurs once in our Bible. It's a Greek term. Hapax legomena means it just happens once. And if it's the only time it's used, what exactly does that word mean? Because we don't read it anywhere else. How do we know what that word means? So that's very difficult to translate. But why they do that in this case, I don't know. Get them on the phone. Maybe we have the version according to Chris. Queen Chris version. That's the QVJ. Other questions or comments? Anything in the concept, I guess, is what I would want you to think about. What does it mean for this God to come in the flesh? and to be a very different sort of being in our midst. How does that nurture our following of Jesus? If we understand his identity in that way, and we understand the being of God, what God is like in his character from the actions of Jesus. Because Jesus is God's ultimate word to us. Sometimes you read the First Testament. Remember, we were doing stories through different books last year, and we looked at the life of David, and you think, whoa, what's this God like? What's his character like? Because pretty funky things are happening here. God's best, clearest, fullest expression of his word to us is himself in flesh. This is God's character ultimately best expressed because it's him living amongst us as a human being. That's what Jesus is claiming about himself. So that needs to keep challenging our assumptions about what God is like. Because he's different to all the other gods of the other religions. Their God is not like this humble Jesus. Okay? Let's move on to the second picture. Yep, Lynn? Yes. That's a great point. If you mightn't have heard, Lynn speaks about God's faithfulness. So we had glimpses of what God was doing. It's not that he scrapped that and threw it all away. He reinterprets or twists and fulfills in much bigger ways than we can understand those original promises he made to the people of Israel through history. And that's what Jesus is saying. You expect God to do this. God is acting in faithfulness to his promises, but it's not like what you expect. It's not like what you anticipate, because you've not really understood who this God is. You've had prejudiced views based on what you think the word God means. Okay, that's the person of Jesus. First piece of the puzzle. You with me for the 2 and 3? Hanging in there? All right, number 2. Some scribes and their ways. All these people have been coming and throwing questions to Jesus. Pharisees, Sadducees, rulers, elders, biblical scholars, scribes, and they can't undermine him. They can't embarrass him. They can't trip and track him. And so Jesus now starts going, I don't want to say on the offensive, but he now controls the conversation. And he starts to give some warnings. He says, look at these people over here. I want you to see something about their performance, about promotion and power and pretense. Look at these scribes in their pompous solemnity. You know these sorts of people. They wear long, beautiful clothes, long robes that look, oh, these are religious, impressive clothes. It's the robe that the prodigal son was dressed in. It's the robe in the book of Revelation that we will be dressed in. It's impressive, good-looking clobber. Jesus is not saying, I don't like fashion. He's not saying good clothes are bad clothes. It's all about pomposity, dressing to impress, that he's speaking about here. These scribes love their formal greetings in the marketplace. The Talmud, some Jewish instructions said you must greet a scribe with words of honour. Good morning, Reverend Merchant, someone used to always say to me. And I think, no, my name's John, I don't want Reverend Merchant. I'm just, hello, I am Reverend Merchant, but I don't care about that. I'm just John. But some people love all that stuff, titles and the rest, and being spoken of in the right way. These people want first places in the temple. They want the front seats up here near we would say the communion table, they would say the altar. Or when there's a banquet, they've got to sit, if it's the U-shaped triclinium, that sort of Roman arrangement, who gets next to sit next to the host, the places of honour? Well, a scribe should have that place. You riffraff, go up the back, or you might not even sit down, you can stand near the wall. These are the sort of people that impress, that everyone walks in and, oh, they're there, let's honour this person. Look at these people, says Jesus, and how they behave. Their performance reveals who they are. And it's all about being first. In the Greek, it's all the proto. They love the first seat, the first place. It's I. And so their religion becomes a way of propping themselves up in the eyes of others. And so they get up and they make beautiful long prayers. Why? To impress other people. Not out of their heart and love for God or care for what's happening in the world, but everyone says, oh, powerful prayer. Now, isn't that a trap in churches? Great, powerful preacher, really godly person, deep spiritual person. And we get sucked into that stuff as well. Jesus doesn't just say, watch out for these guys to keep them at arm's length. Jesus says, watch out that you don't become like them, because that's the temptation for all of us. In our families, we want to be regarded as important. In our workplaces, we want to count. And people always ask our opinion. What do you think about this? In our churches, we want leaders who we can look up to. Jesus says, that's not my way. Don't become like that. It's pretending. It's flattering others. It's using your religion as a way to get power for yourself. Paul has a wonderful contrast. He writes using the same Greek words, for we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. That whole section in 1 Thessalonians 2 is a wonderful anti-picture of what these guys were. You might want to go home and read just that little chunk of chapter. Paul spells it out really well about hypocrisy. And isn't that a poison in the church today? How we get sucked into our culture that does elevate people of status. We have people we call influencers. You know, Taylor Swift is in the country at the moment and she influences a lot of people. No bagging out about Taylor Swift. I'm not going down that road because I'll lose half the audience. But why do we give people honour and status? Sometimes people deserve it. We should respect people who have something to contribute. But we want to question why we do that. And often it's on appearances, what they look like on the outside. It's the problem of young stars, whether they're pop stars or movie stars or whatever, sports stars, young guys often that rise to fame and prominence and power and money when they're 20 and make an absolute ruin of their life because they don't have the maturity to deal with that adulation. But we can also get sucked into that trap. Think that we are more than we really are, or look at others and not see that, no, they're just a person, good and bad, just like everybody else. There's a warning about others and a temptation for us. Jesus is saying not just these guys are no good, but their whole approach to life is no good. It's not that they just can't work out the riddle about, David and his son. It's the whole way they understand God and his way in the world. That I'm getting rid of all that. The very next passage after our Bible reading, people say how beautiful the temple is. Look at these big stones, Jesus. Amazing building, and it was. And Jesus says, yeah, a few years it's all coming down. Not one stone will be left upon another. The whole thing is out the door. And the temple was destroyed. Don't look at the appearances. Don't think that this is God come in power. It's not. And so don't behave this way amongst yourselves. It's a trap and a temptation that we fall into. I was at a service the other day for a different purpose, and there were a number of pastors present who'd been asked to participate in this service. And one was told, can you give a prayer? But they get up to give their prayer, and 15 minutes worth of sermon as introduction, they finally start praying. Why? Because I'm important and I've got to say something. I've got to impress you. And so the next guy gets up and he's getting the audience to come in and out for his prayer because he's got to make more of a show. And you think, what are you doing here? You're here for another purpose, but you've made it all about you to impress people. And some at the back are going, yeah. And I'm thinking, no, sit down, you idiot. Because you've made it about you. It's not about God. That's not what we want in our church life. Is that all right to say that? Any questions? Any reflections on that second little cameo? How do we not be like these people? Hugh?
So given the fact that the whole church structural system is so broken, how do we actually build the kingdom of God? Like, do we just completely get rid of all of it? Or do we, because just trying to think of like, how do we use the resources that are there now to actually build the kingdom? When I was in the UK, I was
Great question. Did you get all that? What do we do? Because we have made the church just like this, haven't we? I guess I'd say a few parts to that answer. And Steve spoke about life groups. That's why we have life groups, is to have longer discussion, to tease all this out. That's why we meet together. Sermon just gives you some basic information that you can then through the week digest and help each other to flesh out. That's our system. So we write questions out of every sermon, talk about this, this and this to apply what we've learned. I would say we should not be surprised that the church has turned out like that, because we're no better than Israel. We're no better than these scribes. And Jesus wouldn't have been warning from the very first day if he didn't think this was going to be an issue, would he? And you read the other pages of the New Testament, they are jostling for power in the book of Acts. It's why Paul writes his letters to the church saying, don't be like that. You've died to that way of life. Live like Jesus. Live in resurrection life. This temptation is a human temptation. It's been there from the beginning. Early centuries of the church. That's why people fled to the desert fathers and mothers. We reject this institutional, corrupted, powerful church. Christendom. That's not how God brings his powerful victory and makes all creation his footstool. It's been there through the whole history of the church. What do? We do what Jesus did. We trust mustard seeds. We say, this is not how it should be. Let's start something small. Let's see what we can do with our circle of influence. Let's grow something organically that's different. Different from the world, but maybe different from many other churches. Let's be discerning. Let's not get sucked in by adulating and getting swept along with, oh, this is an amazing church. That's not how we talk about our church. This is not the best church in the world. I'm sorry to inform you. It will never be, because I'm here. We are just brothers and sisters walking together. And we help one another. We forgive one another. We're patient with one another. But we encourage one another to keep coming back to this picture of Jesus, who is the Lord but the Son of David, who is with the poor and the humble, who always points to others, is always about lifting them up, not big-noting himself. That's the shocking picture of God we get in the life of Jesus. And that's what he wants to make in us, that we become Christ-like in that way. So we get really frustrated. There's a whole Christian industry bagging the church. You go to Koorong and you'll get a whole shelf of books like that, what's wrong, and they're probably spot on. And you get really cynical and disinterested in church. I'd say don't. Come and make it different. Let's start again. God is gracious. Where sin abounds, grace much more abounds. And he'll keep working out his plans for us if we trust him. That's my short answer to a long and complex question. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. You know that bit, the suffering servant in Isaiah 53? Yeah. There was nothing attractive that would win us to him. Great comment. Yeah. So there are all these pictures in the First Testament of what God would be like. They just didn't read those bits like that. And maybe until you know the answer, you don't understand the question. When we see the solution in Jesus, then we think, oh, of course, it's obvious. But it wasn't obvious. And so you've got to think, well, what is obvious that we aren't seeing? What are we blind to? Fantastic passage. If you want to understand what Jesus is like, go to the book written 600 years before he came, Isaiah 53. Last one, because I'll get in trouble if I'm too long. This picture of the woman, I think, is a really puzzling, interesting one. The widow giving. They weren't literally pennies, but I just wanted to keep going with my alliteration. My sister's called Penny, so I just like to write the name too. Anyway, possessions, poverty, piety. They're at the temple. Rich people coming in, making their donations. Giving has always been part of our response to God. God's people are generous, giving people. Sometimes they did it with taxes, but sometimes it was free will. In the tabernacle, they had boxes like this, where you would come and you'd bring your money and you'd stick it in there. They didn't have banks and safes, so this is the closest thing. And so they would put their offerings in these boxes. When we come to the temple, they had more permanent arrangements. And in Herod's temple, this is a model of it, The place where you came to give was in the courtyard of the women. You know the setup of the temple concentric rings. If you're any person, a Gentile person, you can come in this far, it's the court of the Gentiles. But unless you're a Jew, you can't go in any closer. If you're a woman and a Jew, you can go this close. But then that's it. Blokes only after that. So free men, Jewish men, then priests, then the high priest, but once a year. Concentric circles of coming close to God. Where you brought your offerings, because what they're assuming only Jewish people wanted to do this, was in the court of the women. You'd come into this area, and on the back wall, there would be these little boxes you could put in your money. 2 of them were for the temple tax, we've spoken about that. 5 corresponded to specific offerings that you bring for birds or wood or incense, and 6 were for free will offerings. All the money you put in went for the running of the temple. It's a huge, big place with lots of people doing stuff. Not much different to a church. We need money too. Things don't run on air. And this is how they do it. You could also give extra money for the poor if you wanted to. So what people would do, they would come up to this wall and drop in their offerings. And as people sometimes do, they'd say, here is $2,000 for the upkeep of the temple. Ooh, good work. Bang, in it goes. Literally the word Jesus is, they throw it in. Remember in the Harbour Bridge, you used to do it in the baskets? You know, as you drive across, throw it. I loved doing that as a kid. You know, I'd sit in the seat behind Dad and he'd let me throw it in. And it was, oh, bang. Missed a couple of times, but that was all right. That's what they would do. They've actually found one of these trumpets, horns. They dug it up underneath the rubble. The temple was torn down. It was all stones upon one another. A few years ago, they found one. This is it. This is what they would drop their money into. So Jesus is sitting there up against the wall and watching the rich people throw in their money. When there appears a widow, a poor or very poor widow, and she comes up quietly and Jesus watches her. In her hand she has 2 little coins. They're called lepta, copper coins. Lepta was worth, one of them, 1/64th of a denarius. Now it's all clear, isn't it? Denarius was sort of like what you would get a day labourer for 1 day's pay. So this is cents, tiny amount. 1/64th of a day's pay for a labourer. She has 2 copper coins. Jesus says that's all she's got. It's all she possesses. And she comes up to the little trumpet and in it goes. And Jesus says, "Hui, did you see that? Did you see what happened here?" He's not looking at the rich people. He's looking at this woman. What is happening here as she puts in her money? It's loose change, something you'd lose in your handbag, but not to her. First time I went to China, I was out in the countryside, and you people who've been to China will know these notes, old yuan and jiao. And you could use this little money in the countryside. But when you got to the city, they didn't want to look at this money because it's been replaced by the new yuan. And so I went into a shop, we had all this pile of stuff to try and buy something. The guy just laughed at me. "We don't want that rubbish here." That's the sort of money that she had. "Don't bring that here. It's not worth anything. You'd use it for sinkers when you go fishing. It's just nonsense money." But it's all she has. And she gives that as a free will gift. She didn't have to pay anything. She wanted to. The question is, what's Jesus pointing out by getting us to look at her behaviour? What are we to understand from her? And this is where I'll try and finish quickly. We can see her example as a positive model or a negative one. If those who read it positively say, she's showing what a giving heart is like. When we give, we like to give from a position of safety and security. If we have extra, then we'll give. She doesn't do that. She doesn't say, "I'll just wait till I've got a bit more and then I'll give my offering." She just gives immediately. She gives sacrificially. It's not enough to be generous. Our generosity is displayed not by what we give, but by what we hold back. She just gives everything, all that she had to live on. It could be that this is what Jesus is saying is what a disciple looks like. Because if you belong to God, everything you have is his. You're just holding it in trust to use as he leads you to use it. And so Jesus is saying, disciples, look at her. This is what I want you to be. In that sense, Jesus is not a bad mathematician. when he says, she's given more than all of them. Like, could Jesus not count? No, he's saying God isn't about counting, he's about weighing. He weighs the heart. And that's what I see her doing. That's the positive approach. If that's true, then Jesus is saying, don't go on appearances. We think the rich are the successful. Here is a successful person. She's poor. She's destitute. Don't think God is not with her. That's a positive reading. But is that what Jesus wants us to see? That's how I've always read that text, but I don't think it is correct. Because if you look at the context, what's Jesus doing? He's just warned about people who impoverish or make poor or prey upon people exactly like this, widows. The system, Jesus is saying, has been corrupted. This woman is pious and gives out of love for God, but she shouldn't. Because what's she got left now? Nothing. You have just taken the tiny bit that she had and said, we don't care, we're rich and comfortable. Jesus, I think, is saying this whole system has been corrupted. Because why should the poor pay out of their poverty when the rich do not? The next story, Jesus says the whole system is being brought down. Not one stone will be left upon another. So which of those interpretations is right? Is it a positive or a negative? I guess we can maybe say it's a bit of both. There's much to admire in this woman's piety. But it should make us question, how do we give and how do we approach our possessions and our money? We fear that God's going to do what he did to this woman and take everything from us. And that says we think God's an ogre. And that is against what Jesus is saying in the first bit of the story about him being David's son. God is not an ogre. He doesn't want to make your life miserable. But that's what we fear. But isn't that the tussle of discipleship? Who is the Lord and who is not the Lord of my life? It says to us that this idea of tithing, you give a tenth, is biblical but not Christian. That's why we don't tithe. We don't talk about tithing here. If you earn $160,000 a year, you tithe, you give $16,000, that leaves $142,000 for you to live on. Someone earns $40,000, they give $4,000, they got $36,000 to live on. Is that fair? You're both tithing? No, it's not fair. It's not just. Australia, rich country. 3.3 million people in Australia live in poverty. Did you know that? 761,000 children are living in a house of poverty today. Is that fair? Our government policy says we want to keep you in poverty. You say, no, that can't be right, John. Who sets the allowances? Who sets $43 a day for youth allowance? Just think of rent in Sydney. You get $43 a day. What can you rent? Forget about food or clothing. Job seeker is $54 a day. Who can live on that? A pension, $78 a day. It's assumption that, well, it's your fault. That's what's behind that. We look at you and say, it's your fault, you're lazy, you won't go and get a job for yourself. So therefore we punish you. We keep you in poverty. Does that help someone get out of poverty? Does that equip them for a good life? To be able to participate fully in society? No, it doesn't. This story says, let's question the system. Jesus is always questioning the system. Let's not just think of our individual lives in response to God, but society. He's transforming community. So we must question things. We could talk about stage 3 tax cuts if you like, but I think this story has a lot to say to us about how do we really feel about these issues. Are we any different as Christians from other people in our society in how we treat the poor? Because Jesus certainly was. Constantly. That's who he came for, he said. Is the church there for the poor? Are we protesting and say, this is not right? We don't want to be like these people. We want a different system in our country. When you think about your money, think, what is my first priority? Is it me or is it about the kingdom of God, as Hugh says? Do I see all of my possessions as God's possessions that he lets me keep in trust to use for his good purposes? My motivation in giving is not guilt or obligation or the law that says you must give a tenth or anything else you want to say. We don't use that as motivation. We say, no, see it as an investment. Look at your money as a disciple of a way to grow something. Who would want to miss out on using your resources to see the kingdom of God come? Don't love money and keep it for yourself. Love it and do good with it, because it's a powerful tool. It's a joy to give, says Paul. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 are good places to start if you want to think, what do I do with my money? How do I deal with it? That's why we give. That's why we organise things. That's why we think about money and possessions in a different way, because this is part of our relationship with Jesus. That's what he's saying. Look at this woman. What are you going to learn from her? Questions or comments before I finish on that last bit?
John, if the red shoe appeal is the doorknob where people knock on your doors and ask for money for the Salvation Army. In Sydney, there's an area called Double Bay. You can look it up if you don't know Sydney very well. Look up Double Bay, which is where all the rich people live. I've door knocked in Double Bay and had so many people shut the door in my face and tell me to go away that I was disheartened. The next year I collected in Woolloomooloo Housing Commission, very poor area. People marginalised, people unemployed. I found people emptied their purse into my bucket. People emptied their wallet and gave me all they had because their heart was open to need and to the work of the Salvation Army, as it was saying. There's an example in today's society, well, probably 10 years ago, get a bit on, of what happens in a place like Sydney, where the rich close their door on people in need and the poor open their hearts to people in need.
Thanks, Phil. Jesus said, wealth's deceptive. Who here feels they have enough money? Who's rich enough? Anybody here? Some of you? I don't. I want some more, thanks. When do you ever have enough? You never have enough. It's like drinking seawater. The more you have, the more you want to drink. Jesus says, don't be like that. It is often the poor that are more generous because they know, well, that is enough. I can survive. Many of you give generously. Jesus nowhere criticises these rich people. He doesn't bag them out. And I hope don't get that message that I'm telling you. My intention is not to make you go home feeling guilty, I've got to do more. That's the opposite to what I'm saying. I'm saying let's look at it as an opportunity. It's part of our stewardship of what God has given to us. Let's do good. Let's find the joy of giving. Let's invest in the kingdom of God, not in a second tennis court. Hugh and then Chris.
So Jesus seems to be saying that it's a blessing to have nothing. And you're blessed if you have nothing. No nothing in your boat, whatever. Right? If we all have nothing,
Yep.
we all give away everything, how does anything get done?
Correct. So blessed are the poor. It is a blessing. That's Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew has blessed are the poor in spirit. Luke has blessed are the poor full stop. Notice that? But it doesn't mean we just chuck it all away. Again, a picture of how we wrestle these tensions, because it's a resource, it is a blessing from God, but it's to use. We look at how the early church wrestled with that issue, that they did have a common purse. People brought stuff to share for those in need so that there would be no needy amongst you. But people still retained their possessions. It's about how you hold them. We can hold them tightly for ourselves, or we can say, no, this is a wonderful opportunity to give and do something good. And that's, again, 2 Corinthians 8:9, that's what Paul says. You, Corinthians, were looking for an opportunity to give. These Macedonians, they wanted to be first in giving. Imitate their example. So I don't think, some Christians have thought, Tolstoy and the rest, let's just get rid of everything and live in poverty. That's not a good solution either, is it? Because that's not reality. We need money. It's a tool. It's not a master. Wealth is a tool to use and use well. We need to learn how to wield it And some of you, with great money, can do great good. And some of you do. You invest, you give, you support the work of ministry and mission in the world. That's how we want to be positive people, I think. Chris?
Whenever we talk about giving and being generous, we need to also talk about receiving.
Yeah.
And whether you're able, I would like to ask everybody here, if I offered you $5,000, I knew that you had some need, would you accept $5,000 from me? And I think many people would say they won't do that. So I think it's actually about people being humble enough to receive as much as people being generous to give, and not being, there's no shame, there's no,
Yep. Different.
John Stott talked about foot washing, Lord and Saviour. Remember, talk about the team. And he said, Jesus need feet,
Watched.
but he was prepared to give people the opportunity to serve him.
Yeah. The opportunity to be served. I certainly find that harder in many, to be helped rather than help, because it's about retaining power for yourself, isn't it? I can look after myself. I don't need your help. It's uncomfortable to be helped. We want to break that down as well. We all need help at different stages, and it gives someone the opportunity to use their gifts and abilities and love to help us. It's hard. Like we get our wages out of your pockets. If I find that uncomfortable sometimes, I'm embarrassed to look at you and to say, actually, I've got more need, could you give a little bit more? That's a really hard message to say. I just trust that you'll look after us. But sometimes it doesn't work that way, if I'm honest. No. Honest answer, no. Honest answer, no. Should I? Yes. So I'm a hypocrite, and I put my hand up for that because I find it too uncomfortable. Well, I could tell some stories, but I won't because you'll think poorly of me. Should I? I don't know. Maybe. No, we won't go there. Too embarrassing. I don't want to point at me. That contradicts all I'm saying. Yes, thankfulness. Yeah. Yep. That's who we want to be. That's what, let me finish up. We want to be a people that's different in how we deal with these things. We've talked about giving. We need to talk about earning. We need to talk about saving. We need to talk, this is the whole complex big question. Other possessions, privileges, expectations, support of others. It's a complex thing. Money is an important thing. Money, sex, power. We've got to always have these conversations. We were going to do that as a series, but we didn't get there.